everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate in the set of conversations today. It's particularly important, I think, to foreground the social systems that are a part of all natural disasters and especially fires. So just want to get the conversation started off with Professor Michael Méndez from Urban Planning and Public Policy.
Hey, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to CUSP and for the School of Socioecology for hosting this important event on wildfires and this panel on social systems. We started our conversation today with the Congress member talking about the political moment that we're in and really understanding the sort of twin crises that we're experiencing, both in terms of a political crisis and a climate crisis. So to start off with, since we're doing a social system, I wanted to read a short poem from a feminist poet called "Everything is on Fire." Everything is on fire, but everyone I love is doing beautiful things and trying to make life worth living. And I know I don't have to believe in everything, but I believe in that. So I think this, again, focuses on the twin crises that we're experiencing and the power of communities and individuals and groups to make a change in our society. So today I'll be speaking a little bit about my own research that doesn't take place in Orange County, but looks at statewide impacts to largely rural and suburban areas that have been affected by disasters, particularly to migrant communities. As many of you know, in California, we experienced these devastating fires, and unfortunately, they're part of our history and our culture. These are not black swan events. They're anticipated, likely predictable, and we have a chance to ensure that these events don't turn into actual disasters that affect human societies and our ecological systems. So a key reflection from these past fires and other climate-induced disasters from my own work is that not everyone equally experiences the burden of climate change. The people who are most socially vulnerable in society will experience the greatest impacts of climate change. And these impacts, of course, will be more frequent and severe. They will endure higher levels of air and water pollution and more intense wildfires, heat waves, and other environmental and weather hazards. To acknowledge that while we're speaking about wildfires today, compounding disasters can happen simultaneously. For example, in my research in Sonoma County, the extreme wildfires that year happened during the middle of the pandemic and a heat wave. So compounding three distressing events on socially vulnerable populations. So now more than ever, it's crucial to understand how these events amplify existing inequalities and how to lessen the resulting harm, particularly in the context of extreme heat, and wildfires, and other disasters on the population that I work with, Latino and indigenous migrants. Yet when we talk about how these climate-induced disasters impact communities, it's often articulated in abstract terms, without the faces or human-centered approaches to understanding disparate impacts and the root causes of these systemic injustices. Really focusing, understanding that these communities are marginalized, have a pre-marginalized status before disaster happens. And that's coupled with these inequities in disaster policy, climate action policies, amplifies that marginalized status. So they experience like hyper form of marginalization, unfortunately. In places like California, again, I talked about these compounding disasters. And in essence, wildfires, again, are not isolated disasters. They often now compound with other hazards and comorbidities, or what is called a syndemic in the field of public health. Again, these existing health disparities, marginalized status, low income status, work synergetically with these external distressors as well. So now more than ever, it's crucial to understand how these events amplify existing inequalities, again, and lessen the harm. These populations, again, are already experiencing an undue burden of marginalization, disenfranchisement, and discrimination in their everyday lives before a disaster. And they're often the least prepared to recover from the most severe harms by the climate crisis. And it's really to understand, I was just on a panel last week in San Francisco for PBS with the California Secretary of Natural Resources. And one of the questions was, do you think Californians are prepared for disasters? And the Secretary, being very proud, of course, of the policies that California has advanced and innovated, said yes, absolutely. And I had to push back a little, I guess, and say somewhat. It really depends on who you speak to, particularly homeowners versus renters versus migrants. You know, I've had experiences working with some of these groups in Sonoma, Ventura, Santa Barbara counties, where migrant farm workers couldn't even get out of the region to a shelter because they didn't have enough gas, the high cost of gas, so they would only put in certain amounts into their trucks and vehicles. And then, of course, in a wildfire, the gas station closes. So looking at the law, how do you reach these populations that are often rendered invisible? And then also to put it in context of why it's important to address some of these populations in extreme wildfire events. If we look at the 1964 Hanley fire that burned nearly 24,000 acres in 5 days in Sonoma. And then we look at the 2017 Tubbs fire in Sonoma, and it burned the same amount of acreage in less than 5 hours. Of course, that has to do with our urban development patterns in California. In 1964, Sonoma was less developed. There was less urban development and suburbanization in that area. So just to sort of wrap up, just want to highlight there are positives that community groups that are rendered invisible are working together in creating this form of parallel networks for disaster aid, particularly for undocumented migrants. If they're day laborers, they're migrant farm workers, housekeepers, work in the tourism or service industries. Migrant service aid organizations have become these de facto organizations, Red Cross for these communities, because of course the federal government does not provide services to them because of explicit legislation that excludes non-citizens or legal residents. So these groups stepped up. I served as an academic advisor in 2003 of the first ever in the country Undocu-Fund Summit, where all these organizations that were working on the pandemic, disasters, flooding, wildfires came together on lessons learned, the impacts, the lack of government accountability at the federal, state, and even local level, and what can be done next. So that was a great opportunity to talk with them a little bit more about forward-thinking on disaster assistance programs. And then also, this is not just limited to California. Our wildfire disaster or extreme disaster impacts from climate change are happening all over the country. Here's a Washington Post article about Hurricane Helene that happened in October of last year. And again, very similar things happening in North Carolina. What we see in California is that these migrant serving organizations are creating these parallel forms of disaster mutual aid assistance that FEMA or the Red Cross would normally be providing. And then finally, just want to highlight the role of community-based science. I've worked with a lot of these migrant-serving organizations, labor and environmental justice organizations, to uplift their voices and their data and analysis and put them at the forefront to speak for themselves on these issues. And this co-productionist type of publications, we have several of them. This is just one example, has really been able to garner attention because of that human-centered approach and putting the people that are not only at the front lines of the impacts, but also at the front lines of serving these communities. So we've been able to show the experiences of California to international audiences, such as the United Nations Migration Agency and the United Nations Habitat, which is the urban development agency for the UN. So I look forward to talking a little bit more about these issues, and again, thinking beyond property values, thinking beyond homeowners, thinking beyond the footprint of the fire, particularly for workers that may not live in some of these higher income areas that are impacted by disasters, but it has cascading effects affecting housekeepers, tourism is shut down, infrastructure's shut down, people can't get to their roads, so thinking beyond property values. And then the last point I want to make is if you take a look at this picture of the little girl with the N95 mask, I think because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've all become desensitized to images like this. But if you look at the year, it says 2017, well before the pandemic. So these communities have been living with these unjust disasters for many years before the general population in general and in a form of hyper-marginalization. So I look forward to speaking in conversation with everyone, and thank you for this opportunity.
Okay, thank you, Mike. And next we have Doug Houston from Urban Planning and Public Policy.
Do we want to switch and have Suellen go first since your slides are up?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Okay.
Sorry, that way we don't mess up our slides.
Hi everyone, I am here, Suellen Hopfer from Public Health, and I will start by treating this as wildfires as crisis communication and focusing on messaging in Orange County. I have done some research with Eastern Coachella Valley communities, desert communities where they have repeat fires, and I can weave in a little bit about that, about the different nature of fires, but I just wanted to reiterate the strong winds, for the interfacing with the public, that really is a signal on the background of what's normalized now of our conditions in Southern California of dry conditions and accumulated vegetation. This combination and much more resulting in rapid spread of fires. But just to remind us all, not only in California has the wildfire probability increased 25%, but the human exposure to wildfire has more than doubled in the last decade. And we have here, we see, everyone knows about the Pacific Palisades and Altadena fires. What's not in this picture is actually there are 5 other small fires going on that map that got cut off. And so we do have these small, smoldering fires that just have kind of become background for people. And it's more about smoke messaging in contrast to the explosive fires that result in, rapid destruction of communities. So I just want to bring a framework from the public health perspective that we do want to enlist the voices of the most vulnerable, again, reiterating what was just talked about, but then looking at Orange County. I've worked with communities outside of Orange County, and I don't have data on the LA fires. I haven't been involved in analyzing that in detail, but the most vulnerable in, I don't even know if this is working, is it?
Yes.
Oh, okay. In Orange County would be the older, senior citizens and housing, linguistically isolated communities, low-income mobile home parks. We know even in Newport there's a mobile home park. Those with lower resources to be able to actually leave in a rapid situation. And so we do want to focus on that. This is just another framework that is actually from the city of Irvine. I'm going to talk about the importance of increasing communication between all the agencies involved. That effort has to continue to go on. And while some talks have been about the post-fire in public health, and my work is focused on the prevention side, the messaging, the education, and just not only interagency communication, but then with the public, reaching the linguistically isolated, maybe not English speakers, the unincorporated communities. So in the Coachella Valley, the unincorporated communities are across the United States have very little to no infrastructure, no no services, and it's being cut back for everyone now looking forward. But those unincorporated communities do not have the community capacity to adapt to these rapidly increasing situations with fire and smoke. So this is just briefly, again, you've seen a couple of other maps, but the geographic spatial risk assessment of the wildfires interface communities that are at risk, and then just a reminder that the Laguna Crystal Cove area is a sitting duck like the Pacific Palisades. So that's the geographic spatial risk, but we also in public health and social ecology want to consider the social vulnerabilities, and the ember, what I'm also reminded about is the ember risks, where fire risk jumps. But a few things from a messaging perspective and from LA mishaps is that when you are sending out messaging alerts, I'll be talking about that moving in the next slide, is that you do need to try to get those as accurate as possible. Any mishap will really have cascading effects. So with the LA messaging alerts, they sent them out to everybody in LA County. That was really confusing. And then you have the crying wolf situation where people don't believe the alerts. So we have warning messages for acute evacuation. I'm going to talk about, there's smoke messaging year-round where you can try to raise the awareness, and then you have the acute, it's time to get your backpack and leave, and people don't always believe that their home, whatever their abode will be, it will burn down. And so there is some science on this alert messaging on the right, and that you really need these 5 components. Is it blocked there? It's not, it's blocked on mine. To have these messaging alerts, you need to have, so I'm going to go a little bit into detail here, and also to encourage everyone to sign up for Alert OC. That's the local alert that takes in the local conditions. And that we do, yes, we need to disseminate across multiple channels. Phone alerts are very nimble, that can, we can edit those very rapidly, but then we have also siren alerts through cars in 7 languages through the city of Irvine. There's lots of people in Orange County who don't have phone alerts. But just to get back to this phone, messaging alerts is that you definitely want to have a trusted source. Who's sending the message? It shouldn't be an acronym. It should be spelled out clearly, succinctly, describing the hazard and the consequence. And a warning is different. Warning is get ready. Evacuation mandatory message is it's mandatory. You have to leave. And we know that 10% will not listen to the mandatory leave. You think, people, and then some people don't have the resources. They're afraid. They're afraid their home will be burgled, or they don't have the resources to leave. But those are the vulnerable that we need to increase interactions with. You do need to use geographical landmarks, but who knows what zone you're in? Does anybody know what zone you're in? Because that is all based on zones. Okay, my point taken. You need to use street level descriptions. I mean, for those involved in crafting these, which have to happen rapidly. So street level descriptions about where to go for this is for acute evacuation, and protective actions, what to do if you are to shelter in place, and what you can do to protect yourself from the smoke at home, and then how long is that risk in place? People need to know. So that there's some science behind that, and to have comprehensive, clear messaging so that people will take those alerts seriously and actually act on them. So this is just one psychological framework that we are trying to shift people from perceptions of safety to perceptions of risk. And that involves that they understand the message you send out, they believe it, you personalize it, they have to decide. And milling is when you kind of look around your neighborhood, like you look around what others around you are doing, like people do not want to evacuate their home. They don't want to leave, so they kind of look at what other people around them are doing as a cue to whether they really need to take it seriously and leave. So that's what's happening in those messaging alerts. And then just for staying at home, I was going to bring this, a very low cost, if you're staying at home and there's significant smoke, you just need a box fan from Walmart or any place and a MERV 13 filter. You can buy these in a 2-pack online for $40. But I did the experiments to show that if you closed your windows, I burned pancakes in my kitchen and got the particulate matter up really high, and if you close the window and have this going in your room within a couple of hours, I did a control too. But if you can turn this on. You might need 2 of these. You can bring you can clean the air in the room, and you can bring the particulate matter 2.5 back down. So that is a low-cost solution. It's not a fancy, or expensive filter with ozone producing all this other stuff. So I just wanted to throw that out there, and that I'm gonna a couple more slides. I'm gonna skip this. We did research with communities in Eastern Coachella Valley. It's just from the public health perspective, we do have all these health consequences of persistent smoke, and also co-occurring heat. We had sort of acute evacuation narratives when you have these explosive fires. You have smoke narratives where you don't have, there are different kinds of fires, right? You don't have the big explosive kind, but you have significant smoke in your home, and then co-occurring heat and smoke where the farmers now, they plant at night. They don't even plant anything during the day anymore. They do it at night, which has a whole different set of risks, actually. But everyone probably knows the respiratory health impacts from smoke and fire, but there's sinus, there's ocular eye effects, dermatological effects, headaches, allergic reactions, cardiovascular and mental and psychological health impacts from during fire events and after fire events. So I don't have time to go into detail in that. Just that again, communication with agencies and CERT training is a 24-hour training that's available to anyone in Orange County. It does help with education and residents being familiar with what to do during an emergency. I have Bobby Simmons from the city of Irvine come regularly to my classes. These are the agencies involved in response to wildfire, among others, and I would argue we need to, just like during the pandemic, we need to continue increasing interactions with these agencies and media. Again, these are, don't call 911 during a fire because they won't respond. A ham radio is if everything burns down, AM radio is also an option. And the last slide is they're working on evacuation modeling because they have experienced bottlenecks. If you really do have to evacuate and leave, people go the routes they're familiar with, and that may not be the best route to take, so there can be these dangerous bottlenecks when you're evacuating, and so they're working on real-time modeling of that, which is tricky. I think that's it.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Doug Howson. I'm a professor in urban planning and public policy here. And today I'll talk about the wildfire side of work that was really born out of the water space that Brett mentioned earlier, and historic collaborations with Richard Matthew and Dave Feldman, who are here. we were really struck by major events such as the Thomas Fire in 2008, which was an event with a really very, very horrible wildfire that was followed within 2 months by heavy, persistent, long-lasting rains and resulted in a massive mudslide through Montecito, from the hills through Carpinteria all the way to the ocean with substantial damage. And so that's kind of what, and other disasters like that, sparked our interest in really understanding much better this interaction between wildfires and the potential of having a cycle between wildfires and flooding that had been observed for many years, even decades, but we wanted to dig into it a bit more with the modeling tools from Brett's team about flooding, as well as through a survey that we conducted in the Inland Empire, in Riverside County specifically. And so today I'll be talking about hazard perceptions and mitigation behaviors along the wildland-urban interface, trying to really draw out some of the fire implications. This is a map of the Eaton Fire and Altadena. When we started this work, I became very interested in, of course, what data is available to tell us about the risk areas. And here you'll see, shaded in yellow, one definition of the wildland-urban interface, which is pretty widely adopted and tested and updated. And you see the burn in the darker orangish yellow coming all the way down to the edge of what was defined as the wildland-urban interface, which is, in fact, the yellow shading 1.5 miles from the edge of contiguous vegetation. When I first started looking at these maps, and I would put up the burn scars, in many cases, luckily, the burn scar would take 20 homes or less. They would very much follow the edge of the vegetation. So in my mind, I'm like, how likely is it really that the burn is going to come all the way out this far? And so I was really struck, and it was a wake-up call to me as a researcher who's looked at a lot of this data, just how far in a major event with strong winds, with embers going, as we've heard, definitely 1 mile, sometimes up to 5 miles, how destructive this could be. I was really shocked. We had this hypothesis that it could happen. Fortunately, that many homes did not burn in our study area. Also, I want to just state what has been discussed in a few different ways is just that growth within the wildland-urban interface is very concerning because it's, well, one of the most fastest expanding growing land uses historically, and I believe that this has continued. Here you see the Palisades. These are the property year constructions. Colors may not be completely visible, but the blue properties were older. But you can see as you move from the 1950s to 2000 and past, that there's more growth and development in the mountainous at-risk areas there. And then from this image from the New York Times, you can look at this estimate of which properties have the highest wildfire and smoke risk score. Certainly, we can see the pattern of the increasing growth into these areas, overlapping with the great level of risk. And I think it should be alarming to us all. As we think about the damage, I haven't looked for sure. I would think that some of these had Firewise building construction materials, probably landscaping. Certainly now, I hear in the rebuild, they're gonna really prioritize those kind of mitigation measures at a household level, perhaps wider community level, kind of design strategies to reduce risk. But this development in these areas is pretty concerning. Even though I understand residents and politicians want to rebuild. It's hard to not rebuild in California at the political climate. But I think we need to think about that cautiously. Brett and our teams developed this way of conceptualizing what could be the dynamics in this wildland-urban interface. I won't spend too much time on it, but it's been described through the literature and in our work as a fire and flood cycle. So on the corner at the top, we're representing the mountainous area that burns, representing rain. Could be 2 months, it could be 5 years, but those areas that have burned are still susceptible to massive water flows off because the protective roots and structures of vegetation are gone. And you can see it flowing into an entire system. So we're trying to think and conceptualize how these compound hazards or cascading hazards could work. Because eventually we want to know who's at risk, as well as how do people think about risk and are they prepared? That's the goals of our overall larger effort. The mountainous areas, if under rain conditions, the debris could be coming off the hillsides. Some of it hopefully, if all is working well, will be caught in a debris basin, which could capture those larger materials, and the water in the floodwaters could flow into hopefully clean and unclogged channels. But under certain conditions, if they're not maintained properly, this could become a really hazardous situation, particularly if these flows are quite strong, causing not just folks at risk of fires, and we know that I marked out an estimation of that 1.5 miles here. We were thinking that the fire risk would be maybe conceptually closer, that those people would be most aware of the fire risk. Perhaps they've seen a previous burn, etc. But in reality, we just saw in Altadena that it is very probable now, under severe conditions, that the burns could be much farther. So our model may not capture that yet. We have to kind of recalibrate our thinking. But in terms of the flooding cycle, we could see clogging. We were thinking about mainly debris flow and mudslides closer to the mountainous area. But as you go out, the channels could be clogged. The flooding could leave, water could leave the channels and flow to the community in what we might call ultra-hazardous kind of conditions in flooding that are very unexpected. They may be in a FEMA zone, they may not be. So that would be some of our flooding work there. We picked these blue areas in Riverside County, and it would have been nice if I had put the fire burn areas, but all of these had had fires within the previous 5 years close by, so that they would have an opportunity to be aware of those. I'm just going to focus a little bit on the Corona area. It was in some of the previous maps, but you can think of, so, Orange County is here, our county line, and Corona there, right along the 91 freeway. If you've headed out to Riverside County, you might be familiar with Corona. And the story about the growth of the wildland-urban interface really can be told in this image. We have right here, we have a debris basin, so the black hatched, not sure how good you can see the contrast, is a debris basin that was built in the early 1970s as a response to a wildfire that turned into heavy debris flows into the area. And that prompted the installation of this facility and those well-maintained concrete channels going up in this darker red color towards the river. This area at the time in the 1970s, despite knowing the flooding risk here, this might be where kind of the safe development paradox. The infrastructure was put in, these areas were more agricultural farmland and they filled in since the 70s. We also have these areas up here, which were built in the 1990s, 2000s, and this area there was probably built in the last 5 years. So we certainly hope that they're using fire-wise strategies. And there you see in 2017, there was a historic burn area. So we're looking at, and the blue outline is, we want to think about people living in these areas. Are they perceiving risk for themselves, for their community, and are they taking action to mitigate it? So this is a kind of a pre-preparedness perspective. I'll spare you the details of the survey methodology, but we do have a paper I'll be happy to share if you want. 500 respondents in these areas. So I'll really show two dimensions. One is how do they perceive fire risk? We did ask about floods and mudslides, but I'm just gonna, I'll show them together. For each of the hazards, we asked them to rank. So for instance, close to your home and within 10 feet, the surrounding areas, your surrounding neighborhood or your community in general, is it at no hazard from this particular risk? So they answered this all for wildfire and flooding and mudslides. So is it no risk all the way to extreme hazard? So what we found was there was consistently higher perception of wildfire risk. We did sample these areas because of recent burns, so that might be one reflection. Higher wildfire risk than flood hazards and mudslides overall. But what we found for all three of them is that people ranked their home at a much lower level of risk than their community for all of these. And that we thought was pretty interesting when you start thinking about, well, people's perception of risk, are they more likely to prepare? But also, in terms of risk communication, how are they kind of positioning their hazard? We've looked at that and we've looked at the literature, the psychological literature. One explanation would be spatial optimism, that it reflects a tendency to view proximate environmental conditions as far more favorable than distant ones. So there could be a bit of denial that I'm not at risk, but those folks close by are at risk. Or it could be a simple calculation that, well, if you say community, that's a bigger area, so of course that's going to have a higher likelihood of risk. But regardless of the reason, that that's happening, it becomes, I think, pretty important to understand, are we calibrating communication at this household level or at a community level? And I think the framing could be quite different. This is going to just be a suggestive kind of plus or minus representation about whether or not folks took wildfire preparedness actions. And so we had a set of, we grouped them into 5. Each of these categories might have had several actions underneath. The first is fire insurance, structural retrofits, exterior minor maintenance, exterior vegetative measures, or community actions. And these are the factors that were associated positively or negatively with those. And just to kind of help you think about the underlying dynamics, and we're writing this up and hopefully it will get published soon, we'll be happy to share, is we were interested in that wildfire threat appraisal, so any of those measures from home to community, if a household said, you know, their level of perception of threat was not significantly associated with any of these wildfire actions taken. Also wildfire experience. To me, this says other factors matter more. We need to think about that when we're trying to educate and outreach and provide resources and incentives. What was overwhelmingly and consistently associated with taking action was this idea of efficacy. One would be, does the response mitigate the harm, the risk of fire? And if people believe that this action is going to make a difference, they are clearly more consistently positively going to take that action. The same thing about self-efficacy. Can I, as a homeowner or my household, undertake this action? So that definitely increased. So in terms of messaging, those are some important areas of leveraging and points to make sure that people feel and understand the efficacy of the response and their ability to do it. Those outweigh mostly for costs, but we do see the cost of being a barrier for minor maintenance. That trust in government, we thought could go either way. If people trust in government to protect them, maybe they're less likely to mitigate their own area. But in this case, we found that it was positively associated with taking some actions, as well as lack of knowledge could have a negative influence. This idea of place attachment, so we can consider how attached someone is to their place, and that is it part of their identity? Are they going to want to protect it? And it turns out some of these more kind of participating in community actions and planning, for instance, or exterior kind of maintenance for their neighborhood area, if they felt attached to their place or their community, they were more likely to take those. I can mention, we also looked at other variables such as homeowners. If they're a homeowner, they were more likely than renters. We need to account for both to take certain actions, as well as looking at income status and living in a single family home. Living in areas that have visible vegetation, more visible vegetation nearby, we found interesting was associated with higher likelihood of having fire insurance or taking community actions, thinking more collectively about mitigation. That's a lot of information, but we wanted to highlight the range of factors that are important to considering, and Suellen and we should compare notes about how to apply this to risk communication. Just some takeaways. Preparedness and mitigation, it certainly varies by action type, no one size fits all. And we have to think about, and although I didn't highlight it a lot, residents understood the fire and post-fire flooding are connected, that they did see that perception. That's something we're going to be teasing out a lot more. Messaging for one item or one type of mitigation might help them protect against multiple hazards. With that, I'll say thank you.
Thanks very much for all the very rich presentations. Maybe, Raven has mentioned that we have about 10 minutes for discussion, so perhaps Mike, Suellen, and Doug, you can all join us. I just want to open up the floor to questions. Perhaps while you're all thinking of your first questions, I can just ask one. And that is, what are some of the best outreach strategies to prepare residents for fires that you all have come across?
As far as outreach strategies, I would say at the household level and the community level, increasing the education opportunities and having our fire agencies are just increased visits with various different communities, if that already is a huge help for community adaptive response, and having multiple channels, but then having people know of one place for Orange County where they can turn to for information, and people want to know where can I go if I need to evacuate. I would say just continued education on those fronts.
Yeah, I think that's some excellent starting points, and really understanding that even if we wanted to, government can't do everything, and really understanding what role do community-based organizations, trusted organizations like faith-based institutions, schools themselves, serve as a role to build trust within communities. If it's a undocumented community or just a US citizen or legal resident, oftentimes there may be some disconnect between some of these emergency response agencies. So that's where a lot of these organizations come in well before the disaster, and building the relationships, funding these organizations to create this disaster resource preparedness knowledge, and how do you prepare for this? And I think that's one of the key areas, and understanding the cultural and linguistic context in which you're operating in. All communities are different in terms culturally, in terms of what works best for them. If you're working with the senior population, if you're working with youth, if you're working with limited English speakers, it's all different. And then of course, looking at issues of language justice to ensure that the information is distributed equitably and it's reaching the right communities.
I think think of Firewise education, behavior, and outreach, that there are things that are really effective. But when I was scouring the news and just listening to the testimonials of those folks affected by the LA fires, it was just really impressive when they were very aware, some at least, that were talking to the news about what to do and then observing it working. So in some ways it seems to be that taking these Firewise mitigation preparation actions can make a big difference. Not every time, but certainly can. So I think certain agencies, cities are doing the work of getting the word out there. So I would say continue to reinforce those efforts, outreach, education. I think in a funding crisis at the state and the federal level, we also need to think about how can we prioritize that. It would be great if we can put more of a collective community side to it, so that it's not just one property. We heard earlier that your adjacent properties will certainly add to the risk of yours if you don't have a more collective action. So I think making sure that the Firewise education is from a collective perspective, even a neighbor-to-neighbor perspective, a street perspective. Also, what we need to tease out from our survey more is the difference between owners and renters. Even some owners would tell us that, oh, that was implemented before I arrived. They may have bought it from someone else, or maybe the home already had safer materials there. But from the renter side, we still have more to tease out about. Sometimes they don't have the power or the control to make some of those primary types of decisions or investments. And I think that continues to be an understudied area that we're going to investigate more, but we definitely need, whether they're more mobile, migrant, or renter populations, we really need to take in their experiences.
This is, I guess, a question for you as well. Just sort of thinking, so you've done the surveys on the residents, and then I'm just thinking about kind of in the canyons of Orange County, we've seen approvals or like pending approvals on developments that are very much in this hazard zone. There are mitigating requirements, like, okay, the city's gonna require you to put a water tank. And I'm curious, that kind of makes me think of your work in two directions. One is, do residents have an increased perception of safety around those types of measures? Like, oh, the development is in this high risk zone, but it has a water tank. And the secondary piece is, have you explored at all, like, public officials and their perceptions of hazard risk, and how those are sort of misaligned so that we keep developing in these zones due to housing pressure? I know there's a lot, but just...
Yeah, no, I think think you set some good priorities, and we haven't done all of that work, but it is a concern that I have, is this idea, just like in putting in the basins and the flood channels, are we giving people a false sense of security in the face of some really amplifying and just terrible risks? Doesn't really answer your question. We haven't done that research per se, but I want to follow up with Maddie, one of our previous speakers, about the work that Irvine did about the specific perceptions about different safety measures and which ones, what are the risks, what are the pieces of the risk they're aware of, to kind of line that up with the work that we've done around what mitigation had they taken. So it seems like there might be information out there.
And if I could add on, and again, just thinking beyond just Orange County, because this is a statewide or Western United States problem, Orange County, parts of San Diego, and Montecito have the resources to invest in these fire-wise, these building upgrades. And Montecito is probably considered one of the most prepared areas because of the immense wealth they have, and compared that with just a few miles down to Oxnard in Ventura County, and the differences in fire disaster. And if we go back to the greater LA fires and look at what's happening there, not even accounting for the mess that's happening with FEMA in Washington, D.C., the withholding of disaster recovery funds, that's contributing to LA City budget deficit. They have a budget deficit of $1 million because of the FEMA, but of other issues as well. And those drastic cuts, $1 billion again, are going to be to rank and file staff, particularly in the urban planning departments, public works, Los Angeles sanitation, that were tasked over the last decade under former Mayor Garcetti to create climate resilient neighborhoods and building standards for project approval. So these are at the front lines of the cuts, and I encourage everyone to continue watching the budget hearings that LA is doing around this. And the impact that's going to have with political expedience about the rebuilding process. Also overlay that with the LA Olympics for 2028 is, will LA be able to implement some of these fire-wise issues? I don't know with what we're currently seeing happening in LA City Council and Mayor's office.
I was really interested in hearing about, the idea, the perception of risk and how that impacts disaster preparedness. And I'm wondering, especially in the wake of recent disasters, like the Palisades fire, where we saw just a lot of people affected on a wide scale, do you guys feel like we're seeing a shift in perception and behavior in terms of our relationship with disasters, and thinking more like, because I really do think we're kind of going through a time where we're like, maybe in the past, like what you mentioned, Professor Houston, with, oh, not me, like my house isn't at risk, but like my area is at risk, like do you think that we've seen like a shift in the direction of, okay, no, I'm actually at risk, therefore I need to take these measures? Do you think we're kind of experiencing a different perception? This goes for all of you guys also, it just made me think about it.
And if I may just add one part to that question, this is probably our last question before the break. Just thinking about, what role do you think the social and economic backgrounds of affected residents played in the response to the Palisades fires? And was the response similar to or different from the response to the Irvine and Hearst fires as well?
So for the first, thanks for the question. I do think that there is a heightened awareness right now. I think certainly we are in crisis mode, people really trying to make the tough decisions for the folks who lost their homes or were in those communities, how to proceed. So certainly there's a whole set of questions there, and heightened awareness, and just I think it spreads beyond those areas. If we look at the literature, and perhaps I'll go back to it, there is oftentimes this increased understanding and urgency that with time fades over time. So from the policy standpoint, from the preparedness standpoint, I think the next year or 2 or 3 is probably a good time to take advantage of this heightened awareness and sense of urgency to try to get some of these mitigation actions in place. I think the psychological literature shows that over time, people get more caught up in other urgent, pressing matters. And the urgency changes by socioeconomic status and those types of things, but I don't know that I can tackle the second part, but maybe someone can.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that so our I think the literature is mixed about the perception of risk and whether that drives behavior and whether prior wildfire experience. So I was convinced it does drive behavior, but in our research with the Eastern Coachella Valley, it did not.
And in the study, it did not.
And I was very surprised. So I would argue, also based on the literature, that the socioeconomic status does play a big role, and the efficacy plays a big role. So whether they also, as far, and are you talking about evacuating or just year-round behaviors are different? So as far as evacuation behaviors, people need to have the resources and know, to be able to actually leave and know where to go. If they have nothing, they're going to be very limited. I mean, even we saw that even with Hurricane Katrina, people didn't have transportation to leave. Or and then on the year-round prevention, that's just through continued education and being able to rapidly mobilize local networks is something that, through trusted networks and just these very local networks to mobilize, because even the electronic phone alerts that might break down, and people need to know even how to evacuate their mudslides that may prevent you leaving from a road you're used to taking and you don't know any other way to leave. So it's through the local networks that people will understand what to do in an acute situation.
And again, I agree about the socioeconomic status and the household net worth of the individuals there. Again, if we look at Orange County and parts of San Diego, we got to remember that these are much newer communities. You know, many of them were built after the Silmar earthquake, after the Northridge earthquake. And there's the resources and changes and the willingness of the population to invest in these more climate resilient and disaster resilient types of homes. In places like Palisades, not Malibu, but Palisades, city of Los Angeles, is yes, very wealthy. People were very house rich, but many individuals moving in there in the 70s and 80s on fixed incomes. Their network, their household network is high, but not as high as places where they have liquid cash. And to rebuild again is quite expensive. The reports are that the insurance payouts are not going to be as high as we thought they would be. And then to add another level of the creating building standards is putting on tens of thousands of dollars on the rebuilding process. So we see a lot of people moving out, selling their lots, and developers coming in. But even then, the developers are not willing to invest in this higher building standard, unfortunately. So I think a lot of those factors play into that.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you all so much.
Yeah, thank you.